The cry in the dusk. The sky had begun its slow transformation into evening, a soft golden haze stretching across the quiet suburban street. Stan Whittaker, a man whose life had long been a comfortable hum of quiet routines, turned his pickup truck into his driveway, the gentle crackle of gravel under his tires grounding him after a long shift at the hardware store. His mind was already drifting toward his usual evening, a reheated dinner, a couple episodes of some forgettable detective show, and an early night. There was comfort in predictability, a balm for the years that had slipped by since his wife's passing. Alone wasn't lonely, not for Stan. It was just quiet, and quiet was easy. But tonight, the quiet held something else. It was faint at first, just a sound that blended into the rustling leaves and the distant hum of lawnmowers. But then it sharpened. A cry. Soft, almost afraid to exist, but there. Stan paused, his hand on the truck door, head tilting slightly as he strained to catch it again. It was the kind of cry that tugged at something ancient inside him. The reflexive protective instinct that had once been sharper when his own daughter was small. His daughter was grown now, out of touch for longer than he liked to think about. But that sound, it took him back instantly. He stepped onto the cracked concrete sidewalk, his work boots crunching against scattered leaves. The air had a bite to it, the kind of early autumn chill that made kids run faster to get home before dinner. That was when he saw her. Near the end of the block, just beneath the flickering glow of a street lamp, stood a girl. Small, thin, a bundle of nerves in a jacket 2 sizes too large. Her arms were wrapped tightly around herself, her head down, her dark hair a tangled curtain around her face. Stan recognized her. Mia, the little girl from 3 houses down. His brows knit together. He didn't know her well, just enough for the occasional wave or smile when she walked home from school. She was always quiet, eyes down, rarely meeting anyone's gaze. Her father, Ted, was the type who kept to himself. Polite but cold. Stan had always chalked it up to personality, maybe a rough life. Everyone had their battles. But something about the way Maya stood there, trembling, shrinking into herself, sent cold alarm curling down his spine. "Hey there," Stan called softly, careful not to startle her. His voice carried the gentle weight of someone who'd spent his life fixing things. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" She flinched, just slightly, at the sound of his voice. For a moment, he thought she might bolt, like a rabbit caught in the open. But she didn't. Instead, she looked up, and what he saw in her eyes froze him in place. Terror. Not the fleeting fear of a child who's lost their way or skinned a knee. This was something deeper, rooted, the kind of fear that had dug into her bones and made a home there. "I can't go back," she whispered. Stan's throat tightened. "Back where?" "Home." Her voice was no louder than a breath. "If I go back, he'll hurt me." Stan felt something shift inside him, old gears turning, a part of himself waking up that had been asleep for years. Protective, angry, and scared for her. "Who's going to hurt you?" he asked, though he knew the answer before she said it. "My dad." Stan swallowed hard. His mind raced for explanations, for any reason that would make sense. Maybe she was exaggerating. Kids did that sometimes, but the way her fingers twisted the hem of her sleeve, the bruise peeking from beneath her cuff, told him she wasn't. He said if I ever told anyone, he'd make me disappear. Like Mom. Stan's blood ran cold. "Disappear like your mom," he repeated gently, crouching down to her eye level. "What happened to your mom, Mia?" She shook her head quickly, tears forming in her eyes. "He says she left us, that she didn't want me anymore. But that's not true." Her breath came faster, panic rising. "She wouldn't leave me." Stan's gut twisted painfully. This was no exaggeration. This was fear, real, desperate fear. "You don't have to go back," he said firmly. "You can stay with me tonight. We'll figure this out, okay?" Her eyes widened. "You won't tell him where I am?" "No," Stan promised. No one's going to hurt you while you're with me." She didn't take his hand when he offered it, but she followed him. Step by hesitant step, she walked beside him down the sidewalk, her little fingers clutching the hem of her too-big jacket like it was the only thing keeping her together. Stan unlocked his front door, his own fingers trembling slightly. He was no stranger to stories like this. They showed up on the news every now and then, but they always felt distant, tragic tales from places far away. Never here, never his own block, never a girl he'd waved to from his driveway. He led her inside, the warm glow of the living room lamp washing over the worn furniture and shelves, filled with model ships and half-finished projects. It was a lonely house, but it was safe. "You want some water?" Stan asked. She nodded, still standing in the entryway like she wasn't sure she was allowed to come inside. He fetched her a glass, hands shaking just slightly as he poured. When he handed it to her, she clutched it with both hands, knuckles white. For a long while, neither of them spoke. She sat on the couch, her small form barely taking up any space, while Stan sat in his worn armchair, watching her from across the room. "Do you want to tell me what happened?" he asked gently. She shook her head at first, but then the words started tumbling out, halting, broken, like pieces of something shattered she was trying to put back together. "He gets mad a lot," she whispered. "At me. At everything. After Mom disappeared, it got worse. He says it's my fault, that I remind him of her." Stan's jaw clenched. "Has he hurt you before?" She nodded, biting her lip so hard it trembled. "He hit me when I asked about Mom. He locked me in my room for days once. Said if I ever told anyone, he'd make me disappear too." Her voice broke on the last word, and Stan had to fight to keep his own emotions in check. There was a storm building inside him, a mix of anger and sorrow and helplessness. "We're going to get you help," he said, voice steady despite the quake in his chest. "I'm going to call someone who knows what to do, and they'll make sure you're safe." Mia's eyes filled with tears. "They'll believe me." "I believe you," Stan said firmly. "And they will too." He picked up his phone, fingers hovering over the keypad. Who do you even call in a moment like this? The police, Child Protective Services, a neighbor. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing. No child should ever feel this alone. He dialed the number of Miss Greenwood, the school counselor whose card he picked up at a fundraiser months ago. When she answered, Stan explained quickly. The girl, the fear, the bruises, the disappearance of her mother. And Miss Greenwood's calm but urgent response gave him a flicker of hope. "We'll contact Child Protective Services immediately," she assured him. "You did the right thing by calling. Keep Mia safe. Don't let anyone in, especially not her father." When Stan hung up, he looked at Mia. Her eyes, wide and fearful, locked onto his. "No one's going to hurt you here," Stan promised. She curled up on the couch, pulling his old blanket around her shoulders, small and fragile, but maybe just a little less alone. And for the first time in years, Stan Whittaker knew exactly why he was here. To make sure that little girl's voice was finally heard. The secrets behind closed doors. The silence of the house felt heavier after the call ended. The warm glow of the living room lamp softened the edges of the moment, but nothing could soften the weight in Stan's chest. Maya sat curled in the corner of the couch, knees drawn to her chest, her too big jacket still wrapped around her like armor. Stan moved quietly to the window, peeking through the curtains. The street was as quiet as it always was, porch lights flickering to life, a dog barking 2 houses down, a passing car rumbling along the pavement. Normalcy. The same peaceful neighborhood it had always been. Except it wasn't. Not anymore. He turned back to Mia, who had barely moved since she sat down. Her wide, wary eyes flicked up to him now and then, as if she expected him to change his mind, to turn her away, to send her back into the night where the real monsters lived. "Do you want something to eat?" Stan asked softly. "I've got soup, or I can make a sandwich." Mia shook her head, her chin barely moving against her knees. "I'm not hungry." "Okay," Stan said, though he could see how thin she was, how her wrists were nothing more than fragile twigs poking out from her sleeves. His stomach twisted again. Had anyone been feeding her at all? The phone sat heavy in his hand. Miss Greenwood had promised to contact CPS and the police, but no one had arrived yet. Every passing minute felt like sand slipping through an hourglass. He felt the need to do something, but the only thing to do now was wait and protect. "Can I ask you something, Mia?" Stan said, settling into the armchair across from her. She didn't answer right away, but after a few seconds, she gave a tiny shrug. Permission, or at least not refusal. "Why did you come outside tonight? Did something happen?" Her breath hitched just a little, and she rubbed her sleeve across her face before answering. "He was drinking," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He drinks a lot now, more than before." Stan leaned forward, hands clasped between his knees, heart heavy with the weight of her words. "He was mad because I didn't clean the kitchen right. He said I was useless, just like her. Her mother." "What happened after that?" Stan asked gently. Mia's fingers curled into the blanket, twisting the fabric until her knuckles turned white. "He threw a glass at the wall," she said. "It broke everywhere. I tried to clean it up, but he just kept yelling. He said I was just waiting to leave him too, like she did." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she took a deep, shaky breath to steady herself. "I ran out the back door when he went to get another beer," she whispered. "I didn't know where to go." Stan's throat tightened. "I'm glad you came here," he said. "You're safe now." But safe felt fragile. It felt temporary, a thin layer of ice over deep water. Stan stood, moving to the front door again. He peered out the window, scanning the street for any sign of Ted. The night felt watchful, like something was hiding just out of sight. There was no one there, but that didn't mean Ted wasn't looking. "Does your dad know you ran away before?" Stan asked, voice low. Mia shook her head. "I never tried. I wanted to, but I was scared. He always said if I left, no one would believe me, that they'd just send me back." Stan knelt down so they were eye level. "Listen to me, Mia. You were brave to leave, and you were even braver to tell me what's happening. People will believe you. I believe you." Tears shimmered in her eyes, but she blinked them back quickly, as though crying was a dangerous luxury she couldn't afford. "I just miss her," she whispered, so softly Stan almost didn't hear. "I miss my mom." Stan's chest ached. There was so much this girl had been carrying. Secrets, fear, the absence of the one person who should have been her safe place. "Do you remember the last time you saw her?" he asked. Mia's brow furrowed. "It was a long time ago. I think they were fighting. I was in my room, but I could hear them yelling. Then it got quiet, and the next day, Dad said she was gone. Gone, just like that." "Do you think she would have left without saying goodbye?" Stan asked. Mia shook her head fiercely. "No, she always tucked me in. She always made sure I had my stuffed animals and my nightlight. She would have told me." Stan felt a slow, rising chill crawl up his spine. There were so many stories like this. Stories where people simply vanished, leaving nothing behind but whispers and speculation. But most of those stories didn't involve little girls with bruises and broken glass and fathers who drank their rage into sharper edges. The knock at the door made both of them jump. Stan's heart leaped into his throat, but when he peered through the peephole, relief flooded through him. It was a police officer, uniform crisp, expression calm but serious. Behind him stood a woman in casual professional clothes, a warm but concerned smile on her face. Stan opened the door, keeping his body between them and Mia. "Stan Whittaker?" the officer asked. "Yes. We're here for Mia," the woman said gently. "I'm Patricia. a caseworker with Child Protective Services. Mia shrank back into the couch when they entered, eyes wide with fear. "I'm not going back," she whispered. "Please." Patricia knelt down, her voice soft. "You're not going back to your dad tonight, sweetheart. You're safe now. We just need to ask you a few questions, and then we'll find somewhere safe for you to stay." Mia's hands twisted in the blanket again, but she didn't protest. Stan stepped back, feeling both relieved and powerless. He had gotten her this far, but from here, the system would take over. Whether that was a comfort or a threat, he wasn't sure. The questions started, slow, gentle, but direct. Maya answered in whispers at first, her voice gradually growing stronger as Patricia coaxed the truth out of her one painful piece at a time. The bruises, the broken glass, the threats, the missing mother. Stan listened, stomach in knots, as the full picture came into focus. A house of fear, a child trapped between silence and survival, and the dark, gaping hole where her mother should have been. "We'll take her to a safe place tonight," Patricia said when they were done. "Somewhere her father can't find her." Mia looked at Stan, fear flickering in her eyes. "Will I see you again?" she asked, her voice small. Stan's throat tightened. "If you want me to." She nodded quickly. "I do." Patricia smiled. "We'll arrange for that, okay?" Mia stood, still clutching the blanket, her small figure dwarfed by the room. When she stepped toward the door, Stan bent down, meeting her eye to eye. "You did the bravest thing tonight," he said softly. "I'm proud of you." A tear finally escaped down her cheek. "Thank you." He wanted to say something more, something to ease the fear in her eyes, but before he could find the words, Patricia gently guided her out the door. Stan stood in the doorway, watching them walk to the waiting car, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The car pulled away, leaving the street empty again. But the quiet was different now. It wasn't comforting. It was heavy, filled with unanswered questions and unspoken threats. Stan closed the door, leaning back against it, his heart pounding. The world had shifted tonight. For him, for Mia, for whatever truth lay waiting behind the closed door at the end of the street. And the storm had only just begun. Shadows in the walls. Stan's house felt unbearably empty after Mia left. The quiet, which had once been his refuge, now settled over him like a weight. It was no longer a companion. It was the echo of a girl's trembling voice, a reminder that peace had been built on the thin illusion that danger only lived far away. He sat in his armchair, the television flickering without sound, the image barely registering in his mind. His gaze kept drifting to the blanket Mia had used, still crumpled on the couch where she'd sat. A child's scent clung to it, faint shampoo and the cold, metallic tang of fear. A child had lived in terror less than 50 yards from his front door, and he hadn't known. What kind of world allowed that? The phone rang, jarring him from his thoughts. He fumbled for it, half expecting it to be the police, but the screen showed a different name, Katie Mayfield. Stan exhaled, feeling a mix of relief and dread. Katie, the former teacher from down the block, was the kind of neighbor who had a radar for anything amiss. But like him, she hadn't seen this coming. He answered. "Stan." Her voice was hushed, but urgent. "I heard something. About Mia. Is it true? Did she run away?" Stan ran a hand over his face. "Yeah, she showed up at my door last night." There was a sharp inhale on the other end. "Oh God. Is she okay?" "She's safe now," Stan said. "CPS took her into protective custody. But it's bad, Katie. Worse than I ever imagined." He heard the creak of her porch swing in the background, the familiar sound of Katie pacing when she was upset. "I always had a bad feeling about Ted," she said. "I had her in my class a couple of years ago. Sweet girl. Too quiet. There were bruises once or twice, but every time I asked, she said she fell. The principal told me not to push it." Stan's stomach twisted. "I guess we all let things slide." There was a long silence, both of them sitting with the weight of it. "Do you think her mom really left?" Katie asked softly. Stan stared at the window, at the faint glow of the street lamp outside. "No," he said quietly. "I don't." He could still hear Mia's voice. "She wouldn't leave me." That certainty, the raw grief beneath it, rang truer than anything Ted had ever said. "I'm scared for her," Katie said. "If he finds out she's with CPS, he might do something desperate." Stan's hand tightened around the phone. "If he comes looking for her here, he won't find her. And if he tries, I'll be ready." They hung up after that, both unwilling to say the darker thoughts hovering between them. Stan checked the locks one more time before heading to bed, but sleep was a fragile thing. Every creak of the house, every distant car door slam, sent his pulse racing. The face in the window. It was nearly 3:00 a.m. when it happened. Stan was halfway between sleep and waking when some instinct sharpened by the night's events, dragged him to the surface. The room was dark, but the faint glow of the streetlight filtered through the curtains, painting soft bars across the floor. And then the shadow moved. Stan froze. At first, he thought it was just the wind shifting the branches of the old oak outside. But then the shape leaned closer to the window, just beyond the glass. It was a face, gaunt, pale in the dim light, eyes darting, mouth set in a thin, angry line. Ted. Stan's breath caught in his throat. For a moment, neither of them moved. Just two men separated by glass and a tangle of dark intentions. Then Ted's hand rose, palm flat against the window, fingers splayed like a spider. His mouth moved, but the glass muted the words. Still, Stan could read them. "Where is she?" Stan's stomach twisted, but his mind cleared. He wasn't a young man, but there was steel in his bones, the kind that came from raising a daughter, burying a wife, and learning the value of standing your ground. He moved toward the window, slowly and deliberately, until he stood face to face with Ted. They were only inches apart, separated by nothing but cold glass and the weight of truth. Stan didn't speak. He simply raised his hand, finger pointed directly at Ted, and then traced a slow arc across his throat, a silent warning. Ted's face twisted in rage, but Stan stood firm. There were no words, no threats needed, only that promise, clear as day. "You will not touch that girl again." After a long moment, Ted stepped back, his shadow melting into the night. Stan stayed at the window until the street was empty again, heart hammering in his chest. He didn't sleep the rest of the night. A knock at the door. By morning, the adrenaline had worn off, leaving Stan feeling every one of his years. He brewed a pot of coffee, the rich scent doing little to calm the nerves still buzzing under his skin. At 9:00 a.m., a knock at the door startled him so badly he nearly spilled his cup. When he opened it, Detective Brian Parker stood on the porch, his expression grim but professional. "Mind if I come in?" Parker asked. Stan stepped aside. "You're here about Mia." The detective nodded. "CPS notified us last night, and I reviewed the initial intake report this morning. Sounds like you might have saved her life." Stan shook his head. "She saved her own life. I just opened the door." Parker studied him for a moment. "I need to ask you a few questions and warn you about something." Stan led him to the living room, gesturing for him to sit. Parker took out a small notebook, but for the first few minutes, they just talked. About the night Maya showed up. About what she said. About the bruises and the fear in her eyes. Stan told him about the glass, the drinking, the threats, and reluctantly, about the face at the window. Parker's eyes sharpened at that. "He came here. Last night." Stan nodded, didn't say anything. Just stood there, staring in. The detective's jaw tightened. "We've been trying to locate him since Mia went into protective custody, but so far he's slipped through the cracks." "Do you think he'll try to take her back?" Stan asked. Parker leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Men like Ted, they don't like losing control. and they don't like their secrets getting out. Right now, we have enough to keep him from contacting her legally. But legal paper doesn't stop a man who's desperate. The weight of it settled heavily in the room. What about Mia's mother? Stan asked. Any sign of her? Parker shook his head. We're looking, but there's nothing. No credit card use, no phone records, no sightings. It's like she vanished. Stan's mind replayed Mia's words. She wouldn't leave me. He couldn't let it go. What if she didn't leave? Stan said. What if he made her disappear? Parker didn't answer right away. That's the fear, he said at last. But until we have evidence, all we have is suspicion. Suspicion was cold comfort. Before Parker left, he handed Stan his card. If you see him again, or if anything feels off, call me, day or night. Stan held the card tightly, a thin shield against the storm gathering just out of sight. A house full of secrets. After Parker left, Stan found himself drawn to the sidewalk in front of Ted's house. The curtains were closed tight, the lawn overgrown, the windows smudged with dirt. A house with its own secrets, buried behind walls that had heard too much. He couldn't help but wonder, what had those walls seen? What had they heard the night Susan disappeared? Did they know the answers that Maya was too young to even imagine? As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement, Stan made himself a promise. He might not be a hero. He might be just an aging man in a quiet neighborhood. But for Mia, for her mother, wherever she was, he would not let the darkness stay hidden. Not this time. Beneath the surface. The morning after Detective Parker's visit, Stan stood at his kitchen sink, staring out the window into his backyard. The autumn leaves had begun their slow descent into chaos. Gold and crimson patches scattered across the grass like a painter's forgotten palette. But the beauty of the season barely registered. All he could see was Ted's face at the window. That thin veneer of suburban safety had been torn away, leaving Stan hyper-aware of every sound, every shift in the air around his small home. He couldn't forget the smoldering hatred in Ted's eyes, the cold, quiet rage of a man who felt the world slipping through his fingers. Stan wasn't naive. Ted wasn't gone. Somewhere, he was watching. The house next door, the brown house, sat silent. Curtains drawn tight, mailbox overflowing, a lifeless shell of a place that once, presumably, had been a home. No cards came or went. No lights flickered on at night. Stan found himself glancing at it more and more often, the mystery of it pulling at him like a loose thread. Where had it all gone wrong? When had the house become a prison, then something far worse? Stan had never been the prying type. But now, standing on the front steps with his morning coffee cooling in his hand, he couldn't look away. The answers were there, somewhere inside those walls, and they held the key to Mia's past, her future, and the truth about her mother. It was mid-morning when Katie came walking down the sidewalk, arms crossed against the chill. Her eyes carried the weight of sleepless nights, same as his. "I heard about Ted showing up at your window," she said quietly. Stan sighed, motioning her toward the porch. News travels fast. She stood beside him, her gaze also drifting to the house. He's dangerous, Stan. And if he's desperate enough to come back here, he's not going to stop. Stan's grip tightened on his coffee cup. I'm not going to let him near Mia. Wherever she is, she's safe. Katie gave him a long, searching look. But you don't believe he's given up, do you? Stan shook his head. No, men like Ted, they don't just disappear. They haunt. There was a long silence between them, both staring at the house. Finally, Katie's voice softened. I always wondered about Susan. That name, Susan, hung between them like a ghost. I only met her a couple of times at school, Katie said. She was quiet, worn down, but sweet. You could see the love she had for Mia in her eyes. It's hard to believe she just left. She didn't, Stan said firmly. I don't know how, but I know she didn't. Katie turned to him. What are you thinking? Stan's eyes narrowed slightly. I think there's something inside that house, something that could tell us what really happened. Katie's brow furrowed. The police are already investigating, aren't they? Sure, Stan said, but official investigations take time. They'd wait for warrants. They follow procedures. Meanwhile, Ted's out there, cleaning up whatever evidence they haven't found yet. A chill rippled through Katie. You're not thinking of going in there yourself, are you? Stan didn't answer right away, but the glint in his eye was enough. Someone has to. Katie's voice dropped to a whisper. That's trespassing, Stan. So is breaking a little girl's arm, he said. I'll take my chances. Katie didn't argue further. She just stood beside him. Silent support in a world where the rules no longer applied. Crossing the line. That night, the street was empty, blanketed in the hush of late autumn. Stan waited until the last porch light winked out before slipping out his back door, flashlight clutched tight in his hand. His pulse hammered in his ears as he crossed the narrow strip of grass between his yard and the Browns. The fence was low, unmaintained, easy to step over. A forgotten toy truck lay half-buried in the dirt near the gate, a reminder that this had once been a place where children played. The sight of it tightened something in Stan's chest. The back door was locked. No surprise, but the small basement window near the ground had been left slightly ajar, either by accident or indifference. Stan knelt, gritting his teeth against the ache in his knees, and pried it open far enough to squeeze through. The house swallowed him whole. The air inside was thick, stale with the scent of old wood, dust, and something fainter, a metallic tang that made his stomach turn. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the unfinished basement walls, the rusted tools hanging along one side, the disorganized stacks of boxes coated in grime. It was a house that had stopped being a home a long time ago. Step by step, Stan moved deeper, the creak of the old floorboards beneath his boots loud in the silence. Everything felt abandoned, frozen in time. But there was a weight to the air, like the walls themselves held their breath. He reached the stairs leading up to the main floor, pausing to listen. Nothing. The house was empty. For now. The kitchen was a wreck. Dishes piled in the sink, old beer bottles lined up along the counter, a thin film of grease clinging to every surface. Stan's flashlight beam landed on the broken glass, still scattered across the floor. Mia's glass. He bent down, careful not to cut himself, picking up one jagged piece. A smear of something dark clung to the edge. Blood, or just old coffee. Either way, it told a story. In the dim light, he could almost hear it, the shouting, the breaking, the small feet running for the back door. Stan's hands shook slightly as he set the glass down and moved toward the living room. The furniture was worn, sagging, the TV screen cracked as though something heavy had been thrown at it. There were no photos on the walls, no family pictures or school portraits. It was a house with no memory. But the thing that drew his attention was the locked door at the end of the hall. It was plain, unmarked, the kind of door that could lead to a closet, except for the new padlock bolted into the wood. Fresh, shiny, out of place in the worn-out house. Stan's stomach churned. Whatever was behind that door, Ted didn't want anyone seeing it. He knelt, pulling out the pocket multi-tool he carried for work. The lock was cheap, more for show than security, and it took only a minute to pop it open. The door creaked as it swung inward. The smell hit him first. Damp earth, rotting wood, and something faintly sweet beneath it, like decaying flowers. His flashlight beam swept over the small windowless room. A mattress on the floor, a broken hairbrush, and a woman's shoe, half buried beneath a pile of dirty clothes. Stan's breath caught. The shoe was delicate, small, not the kind of thing a man like Ted would own. He picked it up carefully, turning it over in his hands. The sole was worn thin, as though someone had paced for hours. It had been a prison. Maybe for Mia, maybe for Susan, or both. On the wall, scratched into the wood, were faint marks, tallies, Rows and rows of them, some half-erased, some carved deep. Days counted, days survived. Stan's flashlight swept across the floor again, stopping on a small scrap of paper wedged beneath the mattress. He pulled it free, his hands trembling. It was a note, the writing faint, smudged with age. "Mia, if you ever find this, I tried to get out. I'm so sorry. I love you. No matter what he says, I never stopped loving you." There was no signature, but there didn't need to be. Stan's heart broke. Susan had fought. She'd left a message, hoping against hope her daughter would one day see it. Proof she hadn't abandoned her. Proof of love stronger than fear. The floor creaked behind him. Stan froze, every hair on his neck standing on end. The house wasn't empty after all. Footsteps in the dark. The creak was soft, the kind of sound a house makes when it's settling, when old wood shifts against old nails. But Stan knew the difference. This wasn't the house. This was a person. He stayed perfectly still, the scrap of Susan's letter clutched in his trembling fingers. His flashlight, balanced precariously against his knee, wobbled slightly, sending a faint arc of light dancing across the grimy walls. The tally marks carved into the wood blurred in and out of focus as his heart slammed in his chest. The floor creaked again, closer this time. Stan's throat went dry. His mind raced, calculating his options. He was in a room with one exit, and whoever was out there stood between him and the stairs. The only other option was the small basement window he crawled through, but getting to it meant exposing himself in the open hallway. And there was no mistaking it now. The breathing. Faint. Measured. Just outside the door. Ted. Stan's fingers curled into a fist around the paper. The image of Mia's wide, fearful eyes flashed in his mind. The trembling way she'd whispered, "He'll hurt me." The desperation in her voice when she said, "Don't tell him where I am." Ted was hunting, even now. Hunting for the child he terrorized and the truth he tried to bury. Stan's breath slowed. He wasn't a fighter. He was a hardware store clerk, a man who built model ships and fixed broken lawn mowers. But this was different. This was survival. He stood slowly, careful not to let his boots scuff the floor. His hand found the rusted metal flashlight, heavy in his grip, a poor excuse for a weapon, but better than nothing. The hallway outside the door was pitch dark, but Stan could feel the presence on the other side, the weight of someone standing just beyond the thin wood. Then came the whisper. "Who's in my house?" The words were low, gravelly, the voice of a man halfway between drunkenness and rage. Stan felt every hair on his arms rise, but he held firm, gripping the flashlight tighter. The door had drifted slightly ajar when Stan first opened it, leaving a gap no wider than 2 fingers. Through it, Stan caught the faintest sliver of movement. A shadow shifting, blocking out the dim light from the kitchen beyond. Ted was standing right there. Stan's pulse hammered so loud, he thought Ted might hear it. There was no time for second-guessing. With a sudden burst of movement, Stan shoved the door open hard, the edge slamming into Ted's shoulder with enough force to make him stumble back cursing. Stan barreled past him, flashlight swinging wildly in the dark, the beam slicing through the gloom in erratic arcs. Ted's face flickered into view. Wild eyes, unshaven face, lips pulled back in a snarl. "You son of a..." Stan didn't wait to hear the rest. He bolted down the hall, boots thudding against the floor, pulse roaring in his ears. The back door was still unlocked, his escape route waiting. But Ted was faster. Stan heard the heavy footfalls close behind him, and then a hand snatched the collar of his jacket, yanking him back with surprising strength for a man who drank so much. Stan stumbled, crashing against the wall, his shoulder slamming hard into the peeling drywall. Pain jolted through his arm, but adrenaline drove him forward. He swung the flashlight blindly, the heavy metal head connecting with Ted's forearm with a dull crack. Ted howled in pain, but didn't let go. "You think you can take her away from me?" Ted bellowed, spit flying, his breath sour with alcohol and something stale. "You think you can turn my own kid against me?" Stan twisted, trying to break free, but Ted slammed him against the wall again, his face inches from Stan's, eyes bulging with fury. "You have no idea what you've stepped into," Ted growled, his fingers tightening like a vice. "You think you know my family. You don't know a damn thing." "Where's Susan?" Stan spat, the question tearing out of him before he could think better of it. For a fleeting second, something flickered in Ted's expression. A crack in the armor. Fear, not of Stan, but of the truth itself. "She left," Ted hissed. "She walked out on us." "You're lying," Stan said, voice shaking but sure. "Mia knows it. And I know it." The flashlight hung useless in Stan's grip now, his free hand scrabbling for anything, something to defend himself with. His fingers brushed against a rusted screwdriver left on a nearby shelf, probably discarded years ago. Without thinking, Stan grabbed it and drove the handle into Ted's side. Not the blade, but hard enough to shock him off balance. Ted staggered back, swearing, clutching his ribs. Stan didn't wait. He ran. The back door banged open, cold air flooding in as Stan stumbled out into the yard, feet crunching through the brittle leaves. He half expected Ted to follow, but when he glanced back, the doorway was empty. Ted was gone. The house loomed behind him, silent again, its secrets still festering inside. The truth in pieces. Stan's hands shook as he called Detective Parker from his porch, his breath fogging the air. He gave a hurried, disjointed account, breaking into the house, finding the locked room, Ted's sudden appearance. "You went into the house." Parker's voice was sharp. "Jesus, Stan, you could have gotten yourself killed." "He was there," Stan said, voice cracking. "He saw me. He knows I'm involved." There was silence on the other end, the kind of silence that meant the detective was thinking hard. "Did you find anything?" Parker asked finally. Stan closed his eyes, seeing the scratch tally marks in his mind, feeling the fragile paper of Susan's note between his fingers. "I found a room," he said, locked from the outside. There was a mattress, some old clothes, and a note. A note. Parker's voice sharpened. "From Susan." "It was to Mia," Stan said, his throat tightening. "It said she didn't leave willingly. She tried to escape, but Ted..." He couldn't finish the sentence. The words were too heavy, the truth too bitter. "Stay put," Parker said. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. And Stan, lock your doors." Stan hung up, fingers trembling, and locked the front door, sliding the deadbolt home with a satisfying clunk. His reflection stared back at him from the dark window. Older, paler, more afraid than he'd ever been in his life. But beneath the fear, there was something else. Resolve. He'd stepped into this storm for Mia. But now it was for Susan too. For the woman erased from her own life, reduced to a lie her daughter was forced to live with. Ted could hide from the law. He could hide from his neighbors. But he couldn't hide from the truth. A father's lies. Detective Parker arrived, his presence a welcome weight in the house. Stan led him through everything. The locked door, the note, the confrontation. Parker's expression hardened with every word. "We'll get a warrant," Parker said. "This gives us enough to search the whole house, including any crawl spaces or buried areas." "Buried," Stan repeated softly. Parker met his gaze. Men like Ted, when they think they've erased the past, they get sloppy. They leave traces. We'll find them. Stan stared out the window, at the brown house sitting in silence across the grass. For years, it had been just another house on a quiet street. But it was a tomb. "Mia deserves to know," Stan said. "The truth." "She will," Parker promised. "Thanks to you." But Stan wasn't sure the truth would set anyone free. Some truths were prisons of their own. Walls built from the knowledge that the people you love most have been taken from you, one piece at a time. And some monsters didn't disappear. They lived next door. The weight of truth. The morning sunlight washed over Stan's living room in soft streaks of pale gold, but no warmth touched him. He sat stiffly in his armchair, the phone cradled loosely in his hand, staring at nothing. Detective Parker's voice still echoed in his ears, steady, professional, but tinged with urgency. "We have a warrant. We're going into the Brown house this afternoon. Stay put. Stay safe." But safety was no longer a place. It was a fragile illusion. Shattered the moment Stan saw Ted's face at his window. The house next door, silent and still under the rising sun, felt like a living thing now. It breathed secrets, exhaling decades of violence and fear into the neighborhood that had pretended not to notice. Every squeak of a floorboard, every sigh of shifting walls, felt like the ghost of Susan Brown crying out for someone to finally hear her. Stan didn't want to sit and wait. Every instinct screamed at him to do something, but the reality was, this wasn't his fight to finish. It was Parker's. It was Mia's. It was Susan's. Still, Stan couldn't leave. He stood at his window, watching the convoy of police vehicles arrive. 2 patrol cars, an unmarked sit-in, and a white forensic van. Officers moved with quiet purpose, but the gravity of the moment hung heavy in the air. This wasn't just a search warrant. This was a recovery mission. Inside the House of Lies. Stan didn't follow them in. He knew better. He stood at his window, watching, heart thudding in his chest as officers moved through the house, flashlights sweeping, evidence bags unfolding, cameras clicking to capture the quiet horror hiding in plain sight. Detective Parker emerged after about half an hour, his face drawn tight, sweat beading at his temples despite the cool breeze. He stood in the driveway, talking into his phone, his hand gesturing toward the back of the house. Whatever they'd found, it wasn't good. The temptation to walk over there gnawed at Stan. He wanted to know. He needed to know. Before he could second-guess himself, his feet were already moving. Out the front door, across the lawn, stopping just at the edge of the Browns' driveway. Parker saw him immediately, and to Stan's relief, didn't wave him off. "Stan," Parker said, his voice low. "I can't share everything yet, but—" He ran a hand down his face, his usual composure fraying slightly. "You were right." Stan's stomach twisted. "Right about what?" Parker took a breath. "We found her. Or what's left of her." The air seemed to collapse around Stan. "Susan," Stan whispered. Parker nodded, his jaw tightening. There was a makeshift crawl space beneath the house. He'd covered it with junk, old furniture, scrap wood, but we found it. It wasn't a clean burial, which means he probably panicked when he did it. Stan's mind reeled, imagining the fear Susan must have felt, the terror, the betrayal. To be trapped beneath your own home, silenced forever. How did she die? Stan forced himself to ask. "We won't know for sure until the autopsy," Parker said gently. "But from the initial look, blunt force trauma, likely her head. It fits with the timeline Mia gave us, the night Susan vanished after that argument." Stan gripped the edge of the driveway post, nausea swirling in his stomach. "And Ted?" Parker's mouth pressed into a thin line. "We're putting out a statewide warrant. After your encounter with him last night, we believe he's still in the area, but hiding. So he knows we're closing in." Parker nodded. "Men like Ted don't run far. He's arrogant enough to think he can still control the story. He might even think he can still get to Mia." That thought sent an icy jolt down Stan's spine. "Where is she now?" Stan asked. "Mia." "Safe," Parker said firmly. "She's in an undisclosed foster home, and we have officers monitoring her location." Relief battled unease inside Stan. Ted was desperate, and desperate men were unpredictable. If he couldn't reclaim his daughter, would he come after the man who had taken her away? "Is there any chance I could see Maya?" Stan asked hesitantly, just to let her know she was right about her mom. Parker's expression softened slightly. "Let me see what I can do." The knock at midnight. That night, sleep was a foreign concept. Every creak, every distant bark, sent Stan's pulse spiking. He left the lights on, the porch light flooding the yard, making sure there were no shadows for Ted to hide in. At 12:18 a.m., there was a knock at his door. Stan's heart stopped. The knock came again, soft, almost polite. But it was the hour that made it wrong. No one visited at midnight unless something was very wrong. He moved slowly, gripping the same heavy flashlight he used to fend off Ted. Peeking through the peephole, his heart leaped into his throat. It was Mia. She stood on his porch, bundled in an oversized coat, her hair messy, her small face pale in the light. Stan yanked the door open. Mia. She ran straight into his arms, clutching his waist like a lifeline. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I ran away. I needed to see you." Stan's breath shuddered. "It's okay, sweetheart. You're safe now." He guided her inside, locking the door behind them, his mind already racing. How had she gotten away from foster care? Where was the supervision Parker promised? Mia sat on the couch, her small hands trembling against her knees. "They said I was safe," she said, her voice cracking. "But I was scared. I kept thinking, what if he comes for me? What if no one believes me about my mom?" Stan knelt beside her. "They found her, Mia." Mia's eyes widened. "My mom." Stan nodded, his throat tight. "They found her today. She didn't leave you. She tried to fight. She loved you." Tears welled in her eyes. "I knew it," she whispered. "I knew she wouldn't leave." Stan took her hand, squeezing it gently. "You were brave to speak up. You saved yourself. And you gave your mom the chance to be heard." There was a soft knock at the door again. Stan froze, heart hammering, but when he checked the peephole this time, it was Detective Parker, his face drawn with a mix of relief and frustration. Stan opened the door. "She's here," he said quietly. Parker exhaled sharply. "We've been looking everywhere." "I'm sorry," Mia whispered from the couch. "I just needed to see him." Parker's expression softened. "It's okay, kiddo. But you scared the life out of us." Mia stood, her small hand slipping into Stan's. "Can he come with me? Just until everything's okay." Parker hesitated, then nodded. "We'll work something out." The final goodbye. The next week passed in a haze of interviews, hearings, and legal motions. With Susan's body recovered and the evidence mounting, the case against Ted became overwhelming. When they finally caught him, hiding in an abandoned trailer just outside town, his face was sunken, his eyes wild, but his silence was complete. He wouldn't confess, but he didn't need to. The evidence told the story. Mia was placed with extended family, an aunt and uncle who lived 2 states away, kind people who promised to love her like their own. Stan was given special permission for one final visit before she left. They met at the family services office, a quiet room with bright posters and mismatched chairs. Maya ran straight into his arms, holding on tighter than ever before. "Thank you for believing me," she whispered. Stan swallowed hard. "I always will." They sat together for a while, talking about everything and nothing. Her favorite books, her favorite songs, the things she wanted to do in her new home. "You're gonna be okay," Stan said softly. Mia's smile was small, but real. "I know." When the time came, she hugged him one last time. "Goodbye, Stan." "Goodbye, Mia." As she walked away, Stan stood at the window, watching her climb into the car, not running this time, but going home. The storm had passed, and for the first time, Stan believed that some storms don't break you. They clear the way for something better.